Abilene, Texas, April 3rd, 1998. In the dry stillness of that morning, Hank Doyle, a ranch hand nearly forgotten by the land he served, stood in front of a task no one believed mattered anymore, feeding 3 tired horses in a barn that leaned like a man who'd carried too many years on his back. Neighbors had given up on him. The bank had marked its deadline, but Hank reached for the feed bucket with the same quiet insistence he'd learned as a boy. And something happened in that moment, something small and strange that would shift the course of his life. This is the story of a humble man, worn thin by debt and drought, holding on to the last routine that hadn't abandoned him. A man with nothing left but his calloused hands, and a nephew who still believed he had something worth teaching. What Hank uncovered that day wasn't luck, it wasn't rescue. It was the first whisper of a transformation he never saw coming, a story of silent losses, hidden victories, doors opening 1 inch at a time, and how a single stubborn gesture can rewrite the fate of an entire family. Without revealing what comes next, I'll only say this. Hank Doyle thought he was just feeding his horses. In truth, he was feeding the future that would save his name. But before we continue with the video, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The wind over West Texas carried a dryness that felt older than the fences leaning along the Doyle property line. It was January of 1998, the kind of winter that didn't bring snow, only a colder version of dust. Dawn was still a rumor on the horizon when Hank Doyle stepped out of the small wooden house his grandfather had built with hands that never once asked for rest. The porch creaked beneath his boots, sounding almost like a warning. Things break before people do, but not by much. Hank adjusted his hat, rubbed his thumb over a splinter he'd caught months earlier, and carried on toward the barn with 2 metal buckets of feed. Their clinking echoed across the empty fields like a reminder of how quiet a failing ranch could become. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay, sun-baked wood, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the feed he mixed himself. Not many men still fed horses the way Hank did. It was a method learned at the knee of his grandfather, a simple, stubborn routine, a balanced blend of grain, cracked corn, salt, and a pinch of a homemade supplement that the old man claimed kept a horse's spirit alive even when the land tried to kill it. Hank never questioned it. Some things weren't meant to be improved, just honored. His 3 remaining horses lifted their heads as he walked in. They weren't the prize stallions his family used to breed. They were survivors, like him, the last living ties to a legacy that had once made the Doyle name respected all the way from Abilene to San Angelo. "Morning, boys," Hank murmured. "We keep going. That's all we know how to do." He poured the feed into each trough, the sound of grain hitting wood sharp and rhythmic. For a moment, he forgot the overdue bank notices stacked on the kitchen table. The barn always did that for him. It swallowed the noise of the world and replaced it with the calm breaths of horses, eating what little he could still offer. But even peace has its limits. As the light crept through the boards, revealing dust floating like golden snow, Hank's eyes drifted to the far wall where old roping trophies hung. Once polished, they were now coated in resignation. His father had won those competitions back in the 70s, when the ranch was alive, and the Doyle men believed the land would carry them forever. Forever had been shorter than expected. The drought of the early 90s had drained their savings. Rising feed prices had crushed what was left. And when his father passed in 95, Hank inherited a ranch that looked more like a memory than a business. Still, every morning, he fed the horses. He told himself it was duty, but deep down, he feared the truth. If he stopped caring for them, the ranch would finally die, and something inside him would die with it. A sudden gust of wind slammed the side door open. Hank turned, startled, as a teenager stumbled in holding a VHS camcorder almost as big as his torso. "Uncle Hank!" the boy shouted, breathless. "Mom said you'd be out here." It was Luke, his sister's kid, a scrawny 15-year-old with more curiosity than good sense. The camcorder was a hand-me-down from their church, and Luke had been filming everything lately. Dogs, tractors, even his grandmother praying before supper. "What's with the camera?" Hank asked, eyebrow raised. Luke shrugged. "School project. We're supposed to show something real. Thought maybe I could film you feeding the horses. Nobody does it like you do." Hank snorted softly. "Son, there's nothing to film. Just a man doing what needs doing." But Luke was already recording. The little red light blinked as he stepped closer, capturing Hank's hands moving with steady certainty, scooping, measuring, mixing. Motions so practiced they looked like muscle memory prayers. "Why do you mix the grain like that?" Luke asked behind the lens. Hank didn't stop working. "'Cause that's how your great-granddad taught me. He said a horse don't eat with its stomach, it eats with its trust. You take shortcuts on the feed, and you take years off its life." Luke zoomed in. "People should hear that." Hank chuckled. People don't care about an old cowboy's habits. But Luke didn't answer. He kept filming, focusing on the way Hank gently slid the bucket under the mare's chin, the way the horse leaned into his touch as if recognizing the care in it. When the horses settled into eating, Luke lowered the camera. "Uncle Hank, you ever think maybe this is your gift?" "Gift?" Hank repeated, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, the way you do things. Nobody my age knows this stuff. Heck, a lot of older folks don't either. Maybe you should teach it." Hank rubbed the back of his neck, a tell that he was uncomfortable. "Teach? Luke, I'm barely keeping this place afloat. Don't have time to be giving lessons." Luke hesitated, then asked the question everyone else had avoided. "Are they really going to take the ranch?" Hank didn't look at him, didn't need to. Pain has a way of answering without words. "Bank says I got 90 days, he said quietly. "Unless I find money I don't have." Luke swallowed hard. The wind outside shifted, sending a low whistle through the cracks in the barn walls, like the land itself grieving. "Maybe someone would pay for this," Luke said suddenly, lifting the camera again. "The way you feed them, the way you explain things. We could make a tape, sell it. Dad buys stuff like that all the time. A tape, a teaching tape." Hank almost laughed, but the idea didn't entirely leave him. Because sometimes the smallest, strangest spark lands where a man least expects it. The horses kept eating, calm and steady, as if unaware that the world outside the barn was collapsing. Hank stood there, staring at the camcorder, wondering how many times life had tried to offer him a way out while he was too tired to see it. "Put the camera away for now," he finally said. "But maybe after chores we can talk." Luke grinned, hope lighting his young face. "You mean it?" "I mean, we'll see." The barn grew quiet again, except for the sound of horses chewing, rhythmic, comforting, alive. The sound that had carried 3 generations of Doyle men through droughts, losses, and long nights. And as Hank leaned against the railing, the first true sunlight of the morning broke through the cracked boards, landing on him like a blessing he didn't feel he deserved. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, that quiet exchange between a tired man, a kid with a camcorder, and 3 hungry horses, was the hinge on which his entire life would turn. A tiny, almost invisible beginning of a story worth far more than the ranch he was about to lose. The next morning didn't feel any different, at least not to the land. The wind still dragged dust across the yard, like a slow broom sweeping away dreams. The sun still rose pale and tired, as if West Texas demanded too much from it. But inside Hank Doyle's chest, something small had shifted, not enough to be called hope, but enough to disturb the silence. Luke arrived earlier than usual, camcorder already in hand. He shuffled across the yard, kicking dirt as if trying to hide his excitement. "Uncle Hank," he called. "You ready?" Hank adjusted his hat and breathed in the cold morning air. "I said we'd talk. Didn't say I'd let you turn me into some TV cowboy." Luke grinned. "You don't have to be on TV, just do what you do." What Hank did felt too simple to matter. Feeding horses wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it was survival, and survival rarely sells. Still, the idea from yesterday lingered like the last ember in a dying fire. They walked toward the barn together. The structure stood crooked, boards weathered gray by years of sun and regret. Inside, the morning light fell across the horses like warm paint, outlining each curve and muscle. The animals turned their heads, ears flicking forward, already knowing the routine. A routine Hank had repeated thousands of times. Maybe that was the point. Luke hit record. Hank exhaled softly, then stepped into the ritual that had become more instinct than choice. He scooped grain with deliberate precision, shaking the bucket just once to level it. He sprinkled salt with 2 fingers. He added cracked corn like a chef adding the final touch to a sacred recipe. "Tell me why," Luke said from behind the lens. Hank kept working. "Balance. A horse burns energy even when it's standing still. Folks overload him with rich feed and it messes with their gut. My granddad taught me to feed for endurance, not for show." "Endurance," Luke repeated, zooming in. "People need that too, don't they?" Hank paused. A faint smile pushed against the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, we do." He poured the mixture into the first trough, the sound of grain spilling like soft rain in a place that rarely saw any. The horse nudged his shoulder affectionately. Hank stroked the animal's neck, slow, steady, careful. His touch carried the weight of 3 generations of men who'd built their lives around creatures who couldn't speak, but always understood. Luke lowered the camera. "Uncle Hank, this isn't foolish. There's something special here. A special doesn't keep a ranch from being taken, Hank answered, though the words felt heavier than he meant. Luke didn't back down, but it might save one. Silence hung between them, stirred only by the deep breaths of the horses. Hank set the empty bucket aside and leaned against a stall door, wiping sweat from his forehead, even though the morning was still cool. "You think people would buy a tape of this?" he asked, not quite believing the question himself. Luke nodded eagerly. "Dad buys tapes on how to fix fences, how to train healers, how to start a tractor that won't start. There's tapes for everything now. People pay for knowledge, real knowledge, and you've got that." Hank's gaze drifted to the shelves where his father's old tools sat untouched. Rust clung to the metal like a slow sickness. They were reminders of the life he'd worked to preserve, a life slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. "What would I even call it?" he asked. Luke shrugged. "Maybe the Doyle feeding system. Sounds official," Hank huffed. "Sounds like something made by a man who isn't broke, but that's the idea," Luke said gently. The barn door creaked as another gust of wind pushed through. Hank looked at the dust swirling in the light. He wondered if his grandfather ever felt this lost, if he'd ever stood exactly where Hank was now, trapped between pride and necessity. Men of the land didn't often speak about fear. They carried it, quiet and folded, in the same pocket where they kept their pocket knife. Finally, he spoke. "If we do this, we do it right. No bragging, no fancy talk, just real work, real lessons." Luke grinned. "That's exactly what people want." "Fine," Hank said, "but we're using your camcorder. I'm not spending a dime." Luke nodded. "Deal." The horses finished eating. Hank gathered the buckets, feeling an unfamiliar sensation buzzing under his ribs. Not quite hope. Not yet, but maybe the shadow of it. As they walked out of the barn, Luke lifted the camera again. "Hey, Uncle Hank? Yeah? You ever think the world might need what you know?" Hank looked at the barren fields stretching toward a horizon that seemed always a little too far away. "No," he said honestly, "but maybe it's time I stopped deciding that for the world." Luke's smile widened, bright as the Texas sun finally breaking over the rooftops. And somewhere in that dusty January morning, the so-called foolish routine, the habit Hank had performed since he was 10, started becoming something else. A message, a method, a lifeline. Though neither of them realized it yet, those first shaky minutes of footage would wander far beyond the Doyle barn and eventually earn more money than the ranch had seen in 50 years. For the next few days, Hank tried to pretend nothing had changed. He fed the horses, repaired a loose section of fence, checked the well pump that groaned like an old man every time it ran. Life on the ranch moved the way it always had, slowly, stubbornly, and without apology. But Luke had changed everything. Every morning he arrived with the camcorder charged, a notebook full of ideas, and a determination Hank hadn't seen in a young man for a long time. They filmed feeding routines, stall cleaning, simple handling techniques, even how Hank checked a horse's hooves for stones. At first, Hank felt foolish, a grown man explaining chores to a lens like it was a student in need of guidance. But after a while, he found a kind of rhythm in it, maybe even comfort. Luke would ask questions. Hank would answer them. The horses, unaware of their cinematic responsibilities, became patient actors in every shot. One evening, just before sunset, Luke set the camcorder on a hay bale to rewind the footage. The barn filled with the soft, whirring sound of the VHS tape rolling back to its beginning. Hank leaned against a stall gate, arms crossed, trying to pretend he wasn't curious. "You want to watch it?" Luke asked. Hank shrugged. "Might as well see how much of a fool I look." Luke hit play. The grainy footage flickered across the small, fold-out screen. There Hank was, older than he felt on the inside, younger than he looked in the mirror. His voice carried a steadiness he didn't expect, roughened by years, but warm in a way he rarely heard himself speak. The horses responded to him with trust that felt almost visible. And the routine looked intentional, meaningful, worthy of being taught. Hank swallowed hard. "This ain't bad," he admitted quietly. Luke beamed. "Uncle Hank, this is great." Hank didn't answer. He didn't know how. Something inside him, a place that had been numb for months, maybe years, stirred like an animal waking up. But that feeling didn't last, because after the footage ended, Luke said something that shifted the ground under Hank's boots. "So, what do we do with it now?" Hank straightened. "What do you mean, what do we do?" "We keep filming. Then, I don't know, maybe you show it to your dad or something." Luke shook his head. "Dad ain't the audience. Cowboys, ranchers, feed stores, that's who needs this." Hank felt his chest tighten. Selling a tape was different from filming one. Selling a tape meant believing it had value, believing he had value, and he wasn't sure he could stretch himself that far. "I'm not some expert," Hank muttered. Just a man trying to keep his land. Luke's voice softened. Maybe that's exactly why people will listen to you. Before Hank could respond, footsteps approached from outside. Heavy, familiar. The barn door slid open with a thud. It was Marty Caldwell, neighbor, rancher, and the kind of man who smelled opportunity long before anyone else could. His hat sat low over sharp blue eyes, and a toothpick rolled between his teeth like punctuation to every thought he had. "Hank," Marty said with a nod. "Boy." "Evenin', Marty," Hank replied cautiously. "What brings you by?" Marty lifted a folded flyer. "Saw this at the feed store. Bank's holding another foreclosure auction this spring. Heard your name might be on the list." Hank's jaw tightened. "Ain't decided yet. Banks don't need your decision," Marty said lightly. "They just need your signature." Luke stepped forward. "He's working on something that might help." Marty raised an eyebrow. "Oh, like what?" Luke lifted the camcorder. "We're making an instructional tape about horse care, feed methods, the Doyle way of doing things." Marty laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively. "Instructional tape? Who's gonna buy that?" "People who need it!" Luke snapped. Hank placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Easy." Marty looked around the barn, eyes scanning the worn boards, the dusty saddles, the old trophies. "Hank, you're a good man. Best hand I ever knew. But this place is drowning. You can't fix a flood by teaching folks how to swim." Hank bristled. "Maybe not, but at least I'm trying." Marty sighed. "If you change your mind about selling off part of the property, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat and walked out, boots crunching across gravel until his truck door slammed shut and the engine rumbled away. Silence filled the barn. Luke broke it first. "Don't listen to him. He doesn't see what I see." But Hank wasn't angry. Not at Marty. Not at the bank. He was angry at himself. Angry that he'd let things fall so far. Angry that he still didn't know if this tape was salvation or just another way to stall the inevitable. "Let's watch the footage again," Hank said suddenly. Luke blinked. "Again?" "Yeah, again." They rewound the tape, watched it, rewound, watched it again, and each time, Hank noticed something new. The confidence in his hands, the clarity in his explanations, the way the horses responded to him like he was part of their heartbeat. By the fourth viewing, Hank wasn't just watching a tape, he was watching possibility. When the screen finally went dark, he spoke the words that changed everything. "Luke, maybe it's time we finish this tape." Luke almost dropped the camcorder in excitement. "For real?" "For real," Hank said. "But we gotta do it right." He didn't know it yet, but that decision, small, quiet, made in a dusty barn under a dying light, was the first sign the world would soon give back what it had taken. And far away from Abilene, in places Hank had never seen, ranchers he didn't know were already facing the same problems he'd learned to survive. Men who didn't know his name yet, but soon would. The following week unfolded with a strange mixture of routine and anticipation. Hank still woke before dawn, still fed the horses with the same deliberate care, still smelled the familiar blend of dust, hay, and early morning chill. But something unspoken hung in the air every time Luke arrived with the camcorder. A quiet urgency, as if the land itself sensed they were running out of time. They spent afternoons filming scenes Hank never thought anyone would care about. How to check water levels by sound alone. How to feel for tension in a horse's jaw. How to judge the weight of a feed scoop by instinct. Luke filmed everything with youthful precision, stopping Hank repeatedly. "Uncle Hank, say that line again. The part about trust." "No camera tricks," Hank insisted. "Just truth. That is the trick." By the end of the week, they had nearly 2 hours of footage. Hank figured that was more than enough for a tape no one would buy. But Luke believed in it with a sincerity Hank wasn't sure how to carry. They sat at the kitchen table one evening, stacks of labeled VHS tapes beside them, a pot of weak coffee between them. Hank rewound a segment, the grainy screen flickering in the dim light. "You think folks will sit down and watch all this?" Hank asked. Luke nodded. "People respect real work, and Uncle Hank, you're as real as it gets." Hank didn't know how to respond. Compliments had never fit comfortably on him. Before he could find an answer, the telephone rang, the old rotary that sounded like a bell mourning the past. Hank lifted it. "Doyle residence." A woman's voice crackled through the line. "Mr. Doyle? My name is Linda Carver. I run the feed store off Highway 277. Hank stiffened. "Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?" "I heard from Marty Caldwell that you're making instructional tapes." Hank closed his eyes. "Damn it, Marty. We're just playing around with something. Nothing official." "Well," Linda continued, "I got folks coming in here every week asking about affordable feed routines. Prices are going up again. If you've got something worth watching, I'll take 2 copies to put on the counter." Hank blinked. "2 copies? Start small," she said. "If they sell, we'll talk more." He almost said no, almost dismissed the entire idea out of fear or pride or habit. But Luke was staring at him with wide eyes, silently pleading. "All right," Hank said. "We can bring 'em by tomorrow." After he hung up, the kitchen fell silent. Luke whispered, "Uncle Hank, that's a store, a real store." Hank sat heavily in the chair, unsure whether to smile or worry. "2 tapes ain't a miracle, kid." "No," Luke said, "but it's the first step." The next morning, they loaded the tapes into Hank's old Ford pickup, the one that rattled like a coffee can full of screws. Luke insisted on riding along, camcorder in hand, just in case something important happened. The drive to the feed store took them past dry fields, rusted equipment, and cattle wandering through patches of stubborn grass. West Texas in '98 wasn't cruel, just indifferent. It let you live, but never easily. Linda Carver stood behind the counter when they walked in, her silver hair tied in a bun, her glasses perched low on her nose. She looked like someone who'd seen too many men promise too much and deliver too little. "You must be Hank," she said, eyeing him, "and this must be the boy." "I'm Luke," he said proudly. "We made a tape," Linda chuckled. "I gathered that." Hank set the tapes on the counter. The labels were handwritten, the covers homemade, nothing polished, nothing fancy. Linda picked one up, turning it over. "The Doyle feeding system. Sounds official." Hank rubbed the back of his neck. "It's just what I know. That's usually the best kind of knowledge." She placed the 2 tapes beside the register. "I'll put 'em right here. Folks can't resist something new." Hank nodded, grateful but uncertain. "Appreciate it." As they walked out, Luke whispered, "We did it, boy," Hank said, shaking his head. "We didn't do a damn thing yet." But deep down, beneath all the layers of doubt, something flickered. 2 days later, the phone rang again. "Hank Doyle speaking." "Hank, it's Linda. They're gone." "Gone?" Hank asked. "What's gone?" "The tapes," she said, almost impatiently. "Sold both. One fella said he ain't never seen someone explain feed the way you do. Asked if I had more." Hank's breath caught. "More? Bring me 10 copies. We'll see how they move." He hung up and stared at the wall, stunned. Luke practically burst through the barn door when Hank told him, "10 tapes! Uncle Hank! That's real!" Luke shouted, spinning in a circle. Hank couldn't deny it. Not anymore. Something was happening. Something bigger than their little barn. They spent the evening duplicating tapes, hand-labeling each one. Hank's handwriting grew steadier with every copy, as if certainty was sneaking into his fingers. When they finished, Hank set the last tape on the table, stared at the stack and whispered, "Maybe this ain't foolish after all." It wasn't the money. It wasn't even hope yet. It was the first sign, the first real sign that the world, tired, dusty, unforgiving, might finally be ready to listen to a Doyle again. The next few weeks unfolded faster than Hank expected. 10 tapes turned into 20, 20 turned into 50. Word spread from the feed store to neighboring towns, then to ranch hands passing through Abilene on their way to rodeos and auctions. Men who'd never heard of Hank Doyle were suddenly asking for that feeding fella on the VHS. But success, even the small kind, has a way of stirring the dust you hoped had settled. Because while the tapes were selling, the bank's clock kept ticking, and the land didn't stop breaking. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the storm came. Not rain, not salvation, but wind. A hard, violent front sweeping across the plains, snapping branches, slamming barn doors, and twisting the old tin roof like it was foil. Hank had been repairing a fence when he felt the temperature drop. He looked up to see the sky turn the color of bruised steel. "Damn," he whispered. He sprinted toward the barn, just as the wind punched it like a fist. The horses inside panicked, hooves striking wood. The structure groaned under the assault. "Hank!" Luke shouted, running across the yard with his jacket halfway on. "The roof!" Together they shoved the barn doors closed, fighting the wind like 2 men wrestling a giant. Dust stung their eyes. The air tasted of electricity and old earth. Inside, the horses were frantic. "Easy!" Hank yelled, grabbing the lead rope of the nearest gelding. "Easy, boy. You're all right." But they weren't. The storm hammered the barn, rattling it to its bones. Hank moved from horse to horse, calming them with hands that refused to shake. Luke's voice cut through the roar. "Uncle Hank, the north panel's loose!" Before Hank could react, a section of tin ripped free with a screech. The wind hurled it across the yard like a weapon. The horses reared again, terrified. "We gotta hold that section," Luke shouted. "Stay here with them," Hank ordered. "No, you need help. Stay here." Luke fell silent. Hank pushed outside into the gale. Rain finally started, a thin, cold sheet, and mud slicked beneath his boots. He climbed the side panel, gripping the splintered wood as wind clawed at him. Every movement felt like lifting a burden and heavier than the ranch itself. He managed to nail the panel back into place, but the effort cost him. By the time he climbed down, he was soaked, shaking, and breathing like a man twice his age. Inside, the horses had calmed slightly. Luke rushed to him. "You okay?" Hank forced a nod. "They're what matters." But the truth was less noble. He wasn't okay. And the storm wasn't the only thing weakening the ranch. Later that night, after the wind died, Hank found a letter tucked under the front door. From the bank. He didn't need to open it to know the tone inside, but he opened it anyway. Final notice. 30 days remaining. The word stabbed deeper than any storm could. Luke appeared in the doorway, watching him quietly. "It's from the bank, isn't it?" Hank didn't answer. Luke stepped closer. "We'll sell more tapes. We'll make more. Luke," Hank said gently. "Tapes don't sell ranches back from banks, but they might." Hank closed his eyes. "Son, this land has been dying since before you were born." Luke's voice cracked. "Then let's save what's left." Hank felt the boy's desperation press against his own, but he had lived long enough to know when hope was outweighed by numbers. "I'm not quitting," Hank said. "But I need you to understand, this might not be enough." Luke swallowed hard, eyes shining with a hurt Hank wished he could spare him. "Uncle Hank, I believe in this. I believe in you." Hank looked away before those words broke him open. The next morning, they delivered another batch of tapes to Linda Carver. She noticed the exhaustion in Hank's posture. "You all right?" she asked. "Storm beat the place up," he said. "Storms do that," she replied. "But you look like you're carrying more than broken boards." Hank said nothing. Linda leaned closer. "You know, I had a fella come in yesterday. Said he drove 30 miles just to get your tape. Asked when the next one's coming." "The next one?" Hank repeated. "Yeah, this one's about feeding, but he wanted something on behavior, routines, trust building." Hank blinked. "Why would anyone want that from me?" Linda's eyes softened. "Because you make complicated things feel simple. And folks are tired of being confused." He didn't know how to accept those words. He still didn't. That night, exhaustion dragged heavy on him. The storm had left the barn wounded, the horses shaken, the land bruised, and on top of it all, the bank's countdown pressed like a boot on his chest. After feeding the horses, Hank lingered in the barn shadows. The lantern flickered, casting gold light on wood that seemed older than time. Luke approached quietly. "Uncle Hank, if we make another tape, a bigger one, could it really help?" Hank's voice was low. "I don't know." Luke stared at him. "What if the storm didn't break us? What if it shook loose the thing we needed?" Hank rubbed a tired hand over his face. "I'm just one man, Luke." "Yeah," Luke whispered. "But sometimes one man is all it takes." Something inside Hank cracked then, not with pain, but with clarity. A tiny shift, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He looked at his horses, worn, loyal, waiting. "All right," Hank said quietly. "We'll make another tape." Luke grinned. "For the ranch?" "No," Hank said. "For the people who need it." But in his heart, he knew this might be the last chance to save everything his family had ever bled for. It was the fall before the turn, the darkest mile before dawn, and dawn was coming. The storm had done more than rattle the barn. It had rattled Hank himself. Something in the wind had shaken loose an old truth. Survival demanded more than stubbornness. It demanded evolution. And though Hank Doyle was a man carved from tradition, he finally understood the difference between preserving legacy and becoming trapped in it. So he and Luke set out to make something bigger, a second tape, longer, clearer, and more complete. Not just feeding, not just routine, a full, honest system built from decades of Doyle sweat. The Doyle method. The name came from Luke, but even Hank had to admit it sounded like something real. The first step was planning. Luke covered the kitchen table with paper and markers, drawing diagrams of horse behavior and feed cycles while Hank stood over him, correcting little details with calloused fingers. "Move that arrow," Hank said. "Horse don't respond to pressure there. Comes across as aggressive." Luke shifted it. "Like this?" "Yeah, that's respectful. Respect. That was the core of the Doyle method. Respect for the animal, respect for the land, respect for the routine that held a family together even as everything else fell apart. For the next 2 weeks, they filmed every afternoon until the sun slipped low behind the mesquite trees. Hank demonstrated groundwork drills, how to read a horse's breathing, how to approach an anxious mare without tightening her fear. Luke filmed from every angle, learning not just the camera, but the rhythm of Hank's world. Hank didn't smile often, but sometimes, mid-demonstration, Luke caught a hint of pride tugging at the corners of his mouth. A man rediscovering not just his craft, but his worth. One evening, after several hours of filming, Luke replayed a section that captured Hank working with an older gelding named Rusty. The horse had always been cautious, but under Hank's hands he moved with growing confidence. The footage showed Hank standing beside Rusty, one hand steady on the rope, the other near the horse's shoulder. "You don't force trust," Hank said in the recording. "You earn it, same as people." Luke lowered the camcorder, his voice soft. "Uncle Hank, you sound like a teacher." Hank grunted. "Never wanted to teach." "Wanting doesn't matter," Luke said. "Some folks teach because they choose to. Others teach because the world needs them to." Hank looked away as the wind slipped through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant rain that would never come. "Let's finish the tape," Hank said. But Luke could tell the words weren't just about the tape. Duplicating VHS tapes was slow, tedious work. They used an old dual-deck VCR Hank bought second-hand from a pawn shop in Abilene. The machine clicked and hummed late into the nights, filling the house with warm static and the faint metallic scent of overworked electronics. As they produced the first 10 copies of the Doyle method, Hank studied the labels Luke had made. Black marker, white stickers. Simple, unpretentious, honest. That was good. Fancy didn't belong in the Doyle family. "What's the price?" Luke asked. Hank hesitated. $30? Too low, Luke said. "This is hours of work and decades of knowledge." "Luke, I ain't robbing people." "You're not robbing anyone. You're teaching them. $50. Hank almost laughed. "50? Boy, you're thinking big." "That's the point," Luke said. "You should too." And for once, Hank didn't argue. When they brought the tapes to Linda Carver's feed store, she lined them up on the counter with a look Hank had never seen before, a mixture of curiosity and respect. $50? She asked. Hank braced himself for criticism. Luke thought. Linda cut him off. "Good. If it works half as well as your feeding method, it's worth twice that." She placed the entire stack behind the register. "How many more can you make?" Hank blinked. "More? Word's spreading. I had 3 ranchers ask when the next tape was coming. They're hungry for something real, Hank, not the polished nonsense on those fancy tapes from out of state." Luke elbowed Hank gently, as if warning him, "Don't you dare downplay this." Hank removed his hat, rubbed his forehead, and said quietly, "We can make more." Linda smiled. "Good, because you're onto something." That night, after feeding the horses, Hank sat alone on an overturned bucket inside the barn, the lantern casting long shadows across the stalls. He held one of the finished tapes in his hands, turning it over slowly. He thought of his grandfather's words, spoken decades earlier under this same roof. "What you know, boy, that's your real land. They can take the dirt, but they can't take the knowing." Back then, Hank didn't understand. Tonight, he did. Luke stepped into the barn behind him. "We're gonna sell out, Uncle Hank. I can feel it." Hank set the tape down gently. "If we do, it buys time. Maybe enough, maybe not." Luke frowned. "I don't want this just to buy time. I want this to change things." Hank met the boy's determined gaze and felt something shift inside him. A slow, steady acceptance that his life was no longer just a quiet fight against losing everything. It was becoming something else entirely. A message carried farther than the fences he couldn't repair. A legacy growing beyond the land that was slipping through his fingers. "Luke," he said softly, "maybe it will." And somewhere deep in the Texas night, with the barn creaking softly and the horses breathing steady in their stalls, the Doyle method began to take shape not just as a tape, but as a calling, a lifeline, a last stand, a turning. And the world, though still unaware, had already started moving toward Hank Doyle, one rancher at a time. If someone had told Hank Doyle that a stack of grainy VHS tapes would turn strangers into students, he would have laughed, a short, tired laugh that carried 3 generations of disbelief. But by the end of spring, the Doyle method wasn't just selling, it was spreading, quietly at first, then steadily, then unmistakably. Word traveled the way it always had in West Texas, through feed stores, ranch hands, long-haul truckers, rodeo cowboys, and women who managed farms with more grit than the men who once owned them. People didn't ask for that horse tape, they asked for that Doyle man, Hank Doyle. A name that hadn't meant much beyond Abilene now drifted into conversations miles away. The change started at Linda Carver's store. Hank walked in one afternoon with a fresh stack of tapes, expecting to leave them beside the register like always. But when he stepped through the door, every head turned. Ranchers nodded respectfully. A young woman waved. Someone whispered, "That's him." Linda grinned behind the counter. "Told you," she said. "You're a thing now." "A thing?" Hank repeated, confused. One of the ranchers, tall, dusty, sunburned from years of open-range work, approached with a tape in his hand. "You Doyle?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Hank said cautiously. The man extended his hand. "Bought your feed tape. Saved me a sick mare. Vet said whatever routine I used brought her back from the edge. Wanted to thank you." Hank shook his hand, stunned. Gratitude wasn't something he'd been prepared for. Linda leaned forward. "You brought 50 copies, right?" "50?" Hank blinked. "No, I brought 20. They'll be gone by Friday," she said. Luke elbowed him. Told you. Soon other stores began calling. Small places at first, Bollinger, Sweetwater, Coleman, then larger ones, San Angelo, Wichita Falls. Some asked for 10 tapes, some for 50. One requested 100. Duplicating that many tapes meant long nights. The VCR hummed endlessly, its mechanical sighing becoming the soundtrack of the Doyle household. Empty VHS sleeves stacked up like poker chips. Luke's handwriting grew neater, Hank's grew steadier. They worked until their eyes throbbed, until the Texas moon climbed high and pale through the kitchen window. Hank often paused to look at the land outside, the same fields that had once mocked him with their dryness, now whispering something different, a future, not guaranteed, but possible. The real turning point came on a Saturday morning when a man in a pressed shirt and shiny boots drove up in a clean Ford with a business decal on the side. Western Rations and Supplies, Distribution Division. Hank wiped his hands on his jeans as the man stepped out. "You Hank Doyle?" he asked briskly. "Yes." "Name's Rick Turner. We distribute feed products across the region. Been hearing your name all month." Hank shot a look at Luke, who grinned like he'd just won a jackpot. Rick continued, "We'd like to carry your tapes in all 23 of our supply stores, but we'd need consistent production. Can you handle that?" Hank's heart stuttered. "How many tapes you talking about?" 500 to start. More if they move well." Hank felt the world tilt. Not with fear this time, but with the weight of opportunity so heavy he wasn't sure his knees could hold it. Luke stepped forward. Yes, we can." Rick smirked. "Good kid." Confident, Hank swallowed. "We'll do our best." Rick handed him a business card. "Call me by Friday. Folks out there want real knowledge, Doyle, and real cells." After he drove off, Hank leaned against the fence as though he'd been hit by a moving bull. 500 tapes, he whispered. Luke practically vibrated with excitement. "Uncle Hank, this is it." Hank shook his head, overwhelmed. "This is work, Luke. Hard work. We ain't fancy. We don't have studios. We got one camera and a VCR held together with God's grace. But people want it," Luke said. "They want you." The more the tapes spread, the more requests came in for demonstrations. Ranchers wanted Hank to visit their places, check their barns, watch how they fed their animals. Some asked him to give talks at regional cattle meetings. Others wanted personalized guidance. Hank turned down the first few invitations, politely, nervously, almost stubbornly. He wasn't used to being needed by people outside his county lines. Then one day, a rancher from Amarillo showed up unannounced. "You Doyle?" the man asked, stepping out of a dusty truck. "Yes, sir. Your method straightened out my yearlings. Best weight they've put on since '93. I want to hire you to teach my crew." Hank opened his mouth to say no, but something stopped him. The barn roof still patched from the storm, the well pump that needed repair, the 30-day bank notice pinned to the fridge. "When do you need me?" Hank asked. The man grinned. "Next week. Pays 500 a day plus travel." Hank nearly dropped his wrench. Luke, who overheard, whispered, "Uncle Hank, that's more money than the ranch has seen in months." Hank didn't answer, but he didn't need to. For the first time in years, the world was paying him for knowing something. Something that had once felt small, even foolish. Something that had kept his family alive. By early summer, the Doyle method had moved from a dusty kitchen project to a regional phenomenon. But the money that came in, as miraculous as it felt, wasn't the part that changed Hank. It was the letters. Handwritten notes from ranch wives thanking him for saving their horses. Messages from old cowboys who said his tapes reminded them of the way things used to be taught. Kids who wrote that they wanted to be just like him. A man who worked with his hands and treated animals right. One letter arrived from a ranch in New Mexico. "Your tapes saved us. Please make more." Hank held that note for a long time. The ranch might still be in danger. The bank might still circle like a vulture. But Hank Doyle, once a quiet, nearly forgotten man, had become something else. A reference, a teacher, a lifeline for people fighting the same battles he'd fought alone for years. And slowly, quietly, the tide began to turn. The land hadn't changed. The world hadn't gotten kinder. But Hank had finally found a way to speak loud enough for the world to hear. By the time summer surrendered to fall, the Doyle Ranch no longer felt like a place fading out of memory. It felt quietly, steadily alive again. The land was still dry. The fences still needed paint, and the barn still leaned like an exhausted cowboy after a long shift. But something moved through the place now, a pulse, a purpose, and for the first time in years, Hank Doyle felt it too. The first royalty check arrived in a plain envelope. the kind Hank usually associated with bills or disappointment. He almost didn't open it, but Luke stood at his shoulder, jittering with anticipation. "Come on, Uncle Hank, open it already." Hank tore the flap and slid the paper out. At first he didn't understand the number. It looked foreign, like a mistake. He blinked, counted zeros, counted again. Luke gasped. "Is that 5 digits?" Hank swallowed. $9,372. Luke whooped so loudly the horses startled in their stalls. "That's just the first quarter," he shouted, grabbing Hank's shoulders. "We did it! You did it!" But Hank didn't shout. He sat down slowly on a hay bale, the check trembling in his hand. Money had never scared him. Losing everything had, and suddenly he wasn't losing anymore. For the first time since his father died, the ranch wasn't sinking, it was rising. More checks followed. Bigger ones. The feed distributor expanded his tapes into Oklahoma and New Mexico. A magazine published an article titled "The Doyle Method: Old Hands, New Lessons." Then a rodeo association invited Hank to give a demonstration. Hank's first instinct was to refuse. Crowds weren't his world, horses were. But Luke insisted. "Uncle Hank, people listen when you talk. That matters." So Hank went. The small presentation at a regional rodeo turned into a standing room only gathering. Cowboys leaned on rails to hear him. Women nodded along with familiar understanding. Kids balanced on bales to get a better look. Hank spoke simply, plain words, honest ways, and when he finished, folks lined up to shake his hand. By winter, Hank was earning more from tapes and demonstrations than the ranch had earned in years. Not fortune yet, but stability, possibility, a road back home. The letter from the bank arrived in early December. Thick envelope, official seal. Hank carried it to the kitchen table, placed it down gently, and stared at it the way a man stares at the final card in a losing hand. Luke sat across from him. "You want me to open it?" "No," Hank said quietly. "I'll do it." Inside was a balance sheet, a repayment calculation, and a number. The number he needed to keep the ranch. Hank set the paper aside and reached for the drawer where he kept the checks from the last 2 months. He spread them across the table like puzzle pieces. One from the distributor, one from a ranch in Amarillo, one from a feed conference appearance. He added them up slowly, then again, then a third time. Because he didn't trust his own eyes. He had enough, just enough. Hank Doyle could pay off the land, his father's land, his grandfather's land. He leaned back in the chair, breath catching somewhere between a sob and a prayer. Luke didn't speak. He didn't need to. Hank whispered, "We saved it. Boy, we saved it." 2 days before Christmas, Hank drove to town in his old Ford. The same truck that had rattled under the weight of despair now carried something heavier. Freedom. He walked into the bank wearing his best shirt and hat, both several years past new, but carrying the dignity of a man who has rebuilt himself. The banker looked up, mildly surprised. "Mr. Doyle, can I help you?" "Yes," Hank said, placing the envelope on the counter. "I'd like to settle my account." It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to undo the weight of 20 years. When the final signature was inked, the banker extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Doyle. The ranch is fully yours." Hank shook his hand, nodded once, and walked outside before the tears could show. When he reached the truck, he rested both hands on the warm metal and exhaled a breath he had been holding since the early 90s. The land wasn't saved by luck, or charity, or miracles. It was saved by a routine so simple it had once been mocked, ignored, forgotten. A routine born in the quiet barns of his grandfather, fed by the hands of his father, carried forward by a man who refused to let the world decide his worth. A week later, on the morning of the new year, Hank stood in the barn feeding the horses. The sun rose slowly, turning the dust in the air to gold. Luke leaned against a post, watching him with a grin. "You're still doing it," he said. Hank looked up. "Doing what?" "Feeding them the same way, even after everything." Hank smiled, the slow, quiet smile of a man who has earned peace the hard way. "This routine," he said, tapping the bucket, "is what brought us here. Why would I change it now?" Luke stepped closer. "Uncle Hank, you know you're a millionaire now, right?" Hank chuckled softly. "Money's nice, but this," he nodded toward the horses, toward the land waking under the morning sun. "This is the real wealth." Luke swallowed. "So what happens next?" Hank placed the bucket down, resting his hand on Rusty's warm neck. "Next," he said, voice deep with legacy, "we teach, we build, we honor where we came from, and we make darn sure no Doyle ever has to fight alone again." The barn grew quiet, filled only with the soft chewing of horses and the breath of winter morning. And when the light finally settled across the Doyle ranch, strong, warm, unbroken. It felt like a table finally set with everything the family had ever been denied. A full table, at last. Not by chance, not by fate, but by the steady hands of a man who never stopped feeding what mattered most.